Your Creative Push, Episode 68.
Sometimes the most effective healers are the ones that have been injured themselves.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and today's episode is part 2 of my conversation with Philip Ruddy. If you missed yesterday's episode, you can easily scroll back in your podcast player or wherever you're listening to this and check out episode 67. You can also find it at yourcreativepush.com/67. But if you have listened to it already, I'll just get right back to the interview with Philip, who is a depth psychotherapist. And we were just talking about some of his requirements for when people come in to be helped to find ways around their creative blocks or ways to get through them. Specifically drugs and alcohol. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the conclusion of my conversation with Philip Ruddy. You mentioned that people have to be sober when they come in. What do you think is the reason why a lot of creative people use drugs or alcohol to be kind of like unconscious, like you were saying?
Well, if you've got a regular, 9 to 5 job, you can leave that job at, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the evening and jump on the subway or drive home, and you're out of that office. You're out of that home. For many creative people, you're living inside of your head. You're working inside of your head. So you think of a writer, a screenwriter, for example. He or she is inside of their head, and just because they turn off that laptop at a specific time doesn't mean that they're able to turn off their mind or their imagination. So some people find, historically, drinking and writing has been well linked, and that's, from my perspective, that's one reason people reach for a shot glass or a glass of wine or a glass of beer at the end of the night. They're trying to cut themselves off from that to disengage, and that can be an easy way to do it. But it can also be an unhealthy way to do it. It can get out of control, particularly if you're simultaneously wrestling with anxiety and or depression and other issues. It can easily take over. So it's a temptation, but I recommend there's other ways to disengage from our work. Mindful meditation, taking a walk, going to the gym. There's so many different ways. If you've got a family, spending time with your children, spending time with your partner, cooking a great meal. There's a lot of different avenues that I encourage that our clients explore. I'm not going to judge them if they're going to choose to do it that way, with drugs or alcohol. That's their choice. But in terms of my working with them, I do require sobriety to do my depth work because it's just not going to work. My goal is to help them achieve a higher level of consciousness, and if they're acting out unconsciously, it's just not going to work. They're going to waste their time.
Yeah. Back in episode 33, we spoke with Victor Yako, and it was a really great conversation about him and his creativity. And he was an alcoholic, and it's funny when you mention that there's a link between writing and drinking. That's true, and something that I have, experienced as well. And I agree with Victor, though, what he was saying. It's that feeling like as you're drinking that you're getting the creative ideas, but then like the drinking kind of can start to take over, and then you kind of push those ideas away, and then it's like you don't even write a word down. You just get these ideas, and you get filled with this like this rush of creative energy. But then when it comes to actually having the discipline to put that energy into your writing, or I think it also applies to many different kind of creative types, you don't actually put the work in.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, many of us can succumb to the romance of the Charles Bukowski modality, right? We think,
Right,
we're all going to be him or whatnot. But Charles Bukowski wasn't even Charles Bukowski. I mean, that was a persona that he created. And yes, he did drink a lot, but, he even admitted it in interviews that this kind of character that he writes about, it's a character. It's what a poet might wish they could be, the ladies' man that could, drink all night long and make love all night long, etc. And there's a long romantic tradition of that. And a lot of people want to take the shortcut and think, well, the alcohol is the key. I'm going to have this alcohol and I'm going to be a Bukowski or a Hemingway, or I'm going to do these substances and I'm going to be Keith Richards. But The fact is, the talent has to exist already. The devotion to the craft has to exist already. The alcohol isn't what made Keith Richards write all these incredible riffs. He had that calling within him, so it's not going to give you that shortcut either. It's easy to think so, but it doesn't tend to be the case for most people.
Yeah, it might give you the feeling of bravery to kind of get past the demons, like to get past whatever kind of blocks that you have. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily the most effective way to kind of live your life.
Yeah, it's not. And, some people can get by and it doesn't become a problem. And others, that it becomes a problem very quickly or builds up over time. So, again, everyone's path is unique. But if you are able to reflect upon this idea that the reason why a lot of people pick up that glass or take that toke or what have you is that they're trying to relieve anxiety, trying to shut off that creative part of themselves so they can just rest and relax and be refreshed for the next day of work. Again, I encourage people to explore other things out there, but that's a personal choice.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that since you had a creative background, that's why you can really relate to the creative types, your creative clients. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? Like you had mentioned some resistances that you've had that you can relate with.
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned, when I first came here, I was working as a script analyst, and I was able to read literally hundreds and hundreds of scripts. And I began writing my own screenplays at the same time. And in the early '90s, I'd written a feature length screenplay that was optioned and shopped around. It ultimately never sold, but that was okay. I'd given it a shot and was trying to develop other projects. But some years later, a friend who had read it called me up and he congratulated me for having sold it. And I was puzzled and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, dude, I just saw it on late night TV. It had almost the exact same title, had similar character, actually some of the same character names and a lot of similar plot points. So I was just mystified. I ended up looking into it and I hired a lawyer and filed a federal copyright suit against a major studio. And ultimately, I lost on the grounds that many stories may have striking similarities. And in our case, I couldn't prove how this particular writer had obtained my original screenplay. Well, we all know there's millions of ways that someone could get their hands on a screenplay, particularly if it had been shopped around, but that's the law. And at the time, I tried to shake it off, and I really thought, well, okay, I gave it a shot. I hadn't begun my psychological education at that point, hadn't begun to transition into this other career, but I was familiar with this Jungian idea that, well, there's a collective unconscious, and perhaps that many people do have the same idea, and this is an incredible synchronicity. And to this day, I don't actually know, if it was that or not. But I found that after that experience, I really began to shut down as a writer. And I began to question the value of even trying to do screenplays. I'd always written short stories, even at the same time while I was writing screenplays. That had probably a dozen or so published in various literary magazines. But of course, you can't really make a living off of short stories. It's for most people anyway, I'll say. So at that point, I really made a decision if I wanted to continue with the screenwriting or if I wanted to shift careers. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to become a producer. I'm just going to get out of the creative end of it and just focus on getting things made, getting things done, becoming more of an executive. And that's what I did. I spent the next 10 or so years working in production. I produced some documentaries of which, I'm really proud of, but I spent a lot of years doing advertising, which, paid very well. It was a glamorous time for advertising. The budgets were really high. We would travel all over the place and film with very interesting, filmmakers, very high-end, fascinating productions, but it wasn't coming from a place of soul. And it was only years later when I was in my early 40s, actually a little bit before that, it was the crash, the financial crash of 2008. I kind of chuckle when I hear myself say that because I've heard so many of your other guests reference that exact same time period
Yep.
as being pivotal in their own creative lives. But how I saw that or experienced that time was that advertising budgets suddenly dried up. These major national companies just kind of froze their ad budgets, said we're either not doing commercials right now, or we're going to do it, one commercial instead of 8 this year. And there's a lot of producers and directors like myself that were suddenly out of work. And we were used to working, freelance nonstop, 24/7, job after job after job. So in my case, that gave me some free time to actually go out, develop my social life. I met the woman that would become my wife. We got married.
Yay.
Yeah, yeah. And I was able to do some real, work on myself, on my soul, to develop myself outside of just being a 24/7 around the clock producer that would, jump on a plane at a moment's notice. I got a life. And, very quickly, just a year after we were married, my wife and I had a baby boy, and I was witness to his birth. We had a home water birth. So it was just me, my wife, the midwife, and a doula. And seeing my son come into the world, it just really instantly changed my priorities and made me really reflect upon what kind of life do I want to lead for the next 40, 50 years that I may be lucky enough to have on this planet. The idea of becoming a psychotherapist and working with other creatives just kind of hit me out of nowhere. It's just this insight. And I think within days of having that, I had applied to the graduate school and was off and running and really revamping my life 100%. That first day standing in this class of students that would become my graduate cohort, I just looked around and I thought, I have found my tribe. I connect with these people. We share common goals, common values. And it was a really a moving moment for me personally. And it confirmed I knew I had made the right decision.
Well, congratulations, man.
Oh, thank you.
So what advice would you give to somebody who has this kind of traumatic thing happen to them, like happened to you, where whether it was malicious in intent or not, your idea was kind of taken from you? How do you get over that?
Yeah, great question. At the time, I didn't know. And because I wasn't someone that even went to therapy at that time, I decided to handle it through becoming a workaholic. That was my decision. Okay, going into film production is kind of like the French Foreign Legion. I mean, you can you can literally work 24/7. That job is never over. You train yourself. You get by on 4 hours sleep a night. But at the same time, it's, your adrenaline is pumping. You're doing interesting things. Everything seems incredibly important. Everything seems incredibly urgent. Even if you're doing a national campaign for, Chevrolet or something, and you've got all these deadlines you've got to hit. These hurdles keep coming up. These budgets you've got to keep under control. These egos, these personalities with, working with directors or agency creatives, et cetera. So it's easy to kind of get lost in that. But for me, as I mentioned, I did that for many years. And meanwhile, I had stopped writing almost altogether during that period. But only when I had kind of this reawakening after the financial crisis and started doing my own therapeutic work, started going to counseling, I realized that wound is still there. It was never really addressed. I never really processed it. In my case, I chose to write my master's thesis on transcending writer's block. And I used active imagination, which I mentioned earlier as being this theory of Carl Jung. In my case, my thesis was active imagination and the evocative image as a way to transcend writer's block. I worked with a series of paintings by the American artist Edward Hopper, whom you may be familiar with. Nighthawks at a Diner being probably the most famous Edward Hopper painting that a lot of people know.
Oh, yeah, I know that one. Yeah.
But what I did was I took a series of his paintings and I entered in dialogue with the characters that are in the paintings. I literally had them kind of come alive and wrote short stories, a short story for 10 of these paintings that I had selected. I wrote one per painting. And that helped me begin to transcend my writer's block. And during this process, I also engaged in a dialogue with my writer's block, described what he looked like and the way his voice sounded, and we had it out. I confronted him, and it was scary. I mean, it really was to actually talk to this block that has stopped you for so many years from writing. Whereas, before when I was a young person, I would write short stories effortlessly. It was just something that was fun. I never thought about it, but I'd been blocked for so many years. So getting this breakthrough really, that was an epiphany for me, and that's really what fuels my therapeutic work with my clients today is knowing that it is possible to break through you do need a lot of help, and having a trained therapist can make that journey a lot shorter. Again, no guarantee of success or immediate results. But if you're willing to commit, there is help for you out there. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway. I went through it myself. That's why I'm able to help others.
I think that's one of the main things in life is being able to use your own trials, tribulations, your own pain to help other people directly. So I really appreciate you doing that.
You bet. I mean, there's this concept called the wounded healer, based upon a Greek mythological character as a centaur named Chiron. And Chiron could heal almost anyone. He had this incredible power for healing, but he himself was wounded by an arrow and couldn't heal himself. So there's this idea that you see in the healing arts a lot of that. Sometimes the most effective healers are the ones that have been injured themselves. And I'm inspired daily by working with my clients. They come to me with blocks, and we struggle together with their blocks. That gives me empathy. It gives me a window into their struggle. I'm inspired by them, and I hope that I can inspire them, through my work with them. It's a mutual experience.
Well, what's a way that somebody who kind of wants to start talking, opening a dialogue with their blocks or whatever it is that's holding them back, what's a way for them to kind of get started with that?
Yeah, I really recommend, whatever kind of your chosen medium is. If you're a writer, then just open up your journal to a blank page, and say, "Hello, writer's block. You've been with me for some time now.
Yeah.
I'd like to know why you're here," and then simply record the response that will come to you. And if something doesn't come to you right away, engage it. Just like, you would if someone was in the room with you. You'd say like, well, I just asked you a question. Do you not understand the question, or are you afraid to respond, or what's on your mind? And for some people, it can take some time. That writer's block may not want to speak to them right away. For majority of the people I work with, however, they report that they get an immediate response, and they'll say, I couldn't move my pen fast enough, or I couldn't type on my laptop fast enough to keep up with all it had to say. Sometimes this writer's block says like, I've been waiting for 5 years for you to ask me this question. We're supposed to be writing poetry, and instead you're writing articles for a trade tech magazine or something. And I'm not going to let you do that anymore. We need to get back to the poetry. Or all you're doing is writing poetry, and we're starving. No one's paying the rent, and this is really stressing me out. So I need to stop your writing because you have to focus on some other real life issues and get in balance with that. I mean, whatever that may be, that part of you, that part of your psyche, et cetera, will often have insights that your conscious mind isn't aware of. So just be open and record what you hear. And if you don't hear something right away, just try it again the next day. I'm a big believer in the idea of morning pages. Again, from the Artist's Way, this concept that, if you can find the time in the morning, for a lot of us, that's a great quiet time. If you can just wake up 30 minutes earlier than you normally do, or if you're a night person, stay up another half hour later and just write. Just either write freehand nonstop, or if you're a laptop person, type nonstop. But just kind of get the words flowing, and don't judge. Don't invite your critic in while you're creating. That's something that a lot of times I'll notice when I talk to my writers about their process, and they'll talk about how this inner critic rises up. And I'll say, you think when Quentin Tarantino's out shooting a film, he's directing his film, he's got the New York Film Circle critics out there in a director's chair behind him giving him advice? Like, it's preposterous. No, there's a time and a place. So when you're in writing mode, stay in creative mode. There's always a time for editing later, but you have to know where you're at with the creative work.
Yeah, and that's good advice for not just writers, but for really any person, like not even a creative person, just any person, just like having a sort of a diary and a dialogue almost with yourself, and kind of putting in the time to. It's like a form of therapy. It's like a meditation, and I can't recommend that enough. And I really like the idea that you said of, as you're talking with your block, you're saying we, because it is a part of you, and it's like you have to kind of get through it together and give the block something and get something in return from the block. So I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Often that shadow part of us, it's something that can also be the root of our creativity. I mean, often that dark shadow side is where these incredible ideas can come from. If you don't treat it well, of course, it's not going to treat you well. It's just the
Mm,
idea of, I once had a client saying, I've got to tie down my muse, tie her to a chair or something like that and get a project out of her this weekend. And I thought, boy, I don't know how many people would
mm.
respond to that idea. Why not light some candles and, have a really relaxing atmosphere and put out some good food? I mean, that's how we host guests in the real world. If you want to, have a conversation, you want to invite a guest into your house, that's what you do. You create a nice welcoming space and try that. And for this particular client, they came back the next week and says, wow, I had a very different experience and it was great. I had a great writing session. So, it's just kind of looking at what we do and how we treat those shadow parts of ourselves can really have a big effect on whether they help us or hurt us.
Yeah, it's like coming at it from a place of love rather than a place of like kind of desperation, and like your client said, tying it down. It's more of wine and dine it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm a fan of Stephen Pressfield's. His book, The War of Art, is great. Although that metaphor, I have a different relationship with the muse, and this idea of going to war, going to battle, that works for him. But for me, it's more of the wine and dine philosophy. Embrace your shadow, create a dialogue, nurture that creative side. There's a time and a place for the war of art, but there's also a time and a place for that nurturing, more open, more healing approach.
Absolutely. And you mentioned synchronicity back there, and actually, that's kind of the reason that we connected. Was you were
Yes.
listening to episode 54 when I was talking with Nathan Carson, and we had this weird moment because he and I kind of just jumped on a Skype call before like one of the listeners had suggested him, so I reached out to him and we kind of just started talking, and I recorded it and it became an episode. But he didn't really know too much about the show and everything, and at one point he was talking about how it's better to just go with your feelings if you're enjoying something rather than kind of setting out, I'm going to do 54 podcast episodes.
Yes.
And then it just so happened that he was episode 54, and it was a really weird experience, I think, for both of us. And I love the idea of synchronicity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about synchronicity and kind of what it means, at least to you.
Yeah, well, synchronicity was a concept that Carl Jung was really fascinated with, and he kind of explored and developed that. But this idea of meaningful coincidence, something like you just imagined. And yes, I was listening to that podcast episode that you referenced, and I chuckled as soon as he said 54, and you said, you're not going to believe this, but you are the 54th show, and you guys were just both blown away by that.
Yeah.
And in the back of my head, I'm thinking like, oh, Carl Jung, synchronicity. And then you guys instantly said the same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jung's idea that we can often encounter these unusual coincidences in life that are impossible to explain rationally. And if you're a statistician, you could say, oh well, the odds of actually doing this and that. There are some odds that would explain this happening. It's a very rare event, but that's simply all it is. You could look at it that way rationally, or you could also say, you know what, I'm intrigued by this notion that the universe sets up these kind of interesting coincidences for some purpose, and we can make whatever meaning of it we like. I've had some incredible synchronistic experiences in my life, and they happen fairly frequently. I would say, maybe once every couple of years, something that's just, so strange that I can now recognize when it's happening or about to happen. I'll just get this feeling, and it's what we describe as a numinous experience where, the world somehow feels illuminated. Things are happening. It almost feels like a dream state, a waking dream. And
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing. And we don't know why it happens. And again, you can either engage with the mystery, or you could find a rational example and just kind of shrug your shoulders. But, as a depth psychotherapist, I love to engage with the mystery.
Yeah, shrugging your shoulders is not a fun way. You got to dive into it. And like I said back in that episode, I always feel like when those things happen, it's like a wink from the universe, like
Yes.
telling you you're kind of like on the right path, or I don't know. It just feels good, and I think that it's good to make it feel good. To allow it to be, this weird thing in your life, this glimmer of something else. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost time to say goodbye, but I was wondering if you could maybe share with us a book or YouTube clip or anything else that you maybe draw inspiration from that we could as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, as I've mentioned, and The Red Book is an incredible document. It's filled with the images that he created over the course of many years. It was kind of his very private and personal journal, in which he would write down some of his experiences with active imagination, as well as the images that he created after doing these active imagination exercises. So the Red Book's an incredible document if you can, if you care to learn a little bit more about it. For people that are maybe in midlife, there's a great author named James Hollis. He's a Jungian psychologist, and he's written a number of books, but one that I really recommend is Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. And perhaps for people that are, in their 30s or 40s or even a little older that still have plenty of life ahead of them and aren't really feeling like they're at a place where they expected to be or perhaps want to be. Perhaps they're going through, a major life change. Could be a layoff or a divorce or separation or, empty nest syndrome. This is a book that I personally found very helpful and I recommend to many of my clients. So again, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. In terms of YouTube clips, there's a couple of them by Ray Bradbury, who again was one of my favorite writers, and I think just one of the more inspirational, creative people that I had ever encountered. I was lucky enough to see him lecture at a UCLA book fair one year, and he's just such a charismatic speaker. And if you just look online for Ray Bradbury, I can probably find some specific ones, but he'll give advice to graduating classes that are just spot on for creative people, and encouraging them to really remember the things that move them in childhood. So often, if we go back to those things that first filled us with joy and delight, if we can reconnect with those, that can be a pathway towards reconnecting with our authentic self. I think he's just fantastic.
Very cool. Thank you for those resources, and we will link them in the show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Philip Ruddy.
Great.
Phil, it is time for the final push, and this is where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of somebody that you've already inspired today, maybe somebody who is kind of ready to start a dialogue with their blocks, and give them your best words of advice and push them into action.
Sure. Well, if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, I recommend to all creative people to really study that map and to remember that your work, the characters in your books or your writing are not the only ones that are on this hero's journey, but you yourself are on this journey. You're going to face resistance, you're going to face struggle, but if you can understand that that's part of the creative journey and that there's no shortcuts, but if you can commit to that journey, the creative rewards will be at the end of that journey for you. It's not always going to be in the form of money, but it's going to be in the form of creative insight, satisfaction, knowing that you've done your best, that you've had the courage and you've gone along in this journey, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. So if that can inspire or help anyone, I'm glad to share that.
Excellent. And I know that you actually had a recent blog post about that.
I did.
Which I read, which was really good. So I'll make sure I link that on the show notes page as well.
That sounds great.
Phil, thank you, man, so much for reaching out and for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, young man, and thanks for doing your creative push. It's helped me personally, and I do recommend it to clients. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, man, thank you so much. That's so nice.
You're
That's
very,
really nice.
You're very welcome. Keep it up.
Thanks, man. And you can find Philip on his website, which is activelyimagine.com. And you can also find him, as I said before, on our show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Philip Ruddy. That's PhilipRuddy. Philip, thanks again, man.
Thank you, young man. Take care.
Oh man, I really hope that this episode, well, these 2 episodes were as helpful to you as they were to me. During the actual interview and also listening back to the episode, I really gained a lot of insight as to, my own creative blocks. And it is really interesting that I never really thought about the fact that, writer's block isn't this like thing that you can kind of catch that everybody has to deal with. And it's the same thing for everyone. It's personalized, because it comes from within you. It's this personal thing that you can actually talk to, like Philip said. It's a part of your subconscious. And the whole point of depth therapy is, bringing that up or tapping into it. So try it. Actually try it. It might seem silly and it might seem kind of weird to just write on a piece of paper, "Hey, creative block, what's up?" But I did it. Like I actually tried it and it actually worked. It was really interesting, the things that came up, things that I wouldn't have thought of before. I talk about my own creative blocks all the time on this show, but one of the first things it said to me, or that I said to myself, or however you want to call it, was, "Hey, nice of you to finally actually address me as a specific thing, as opposed to this general thing that you talk about with your guests," which was kind of interesting. The conversation went on from there, and I won't bore you with the details. I'm sure it will come up in later episodes, but it was interesting. It was interesting to give it a voice, to give it an actual voice, and to, as Philip suggested, kind of be friendly with it. Because it is a part of you. So just try it, and you might be really surprised with what you learn about yourself, and it might be easier for you to kind of navigate it from here on out. And definitely, please let me know, if you're willing, that is, to let me know if you do this with yourself, if you try this out, and if it works for you, if it doesn't work for you, just let me know your experience. You can either write it in the show notes at yourcreativepush.com/67 or 68, or just shoot me an email, youngman@yourcreativepush.com. I would definitely love to hear your experience and see if it worked for you. I'd be totally stoked if it did. On tomorrow's show, we have Andrew Salgado.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. I find a lot of young artists, and particularly artists in their 20s, expect way too much too soon. And then even older artists too. Like, age has nothing to do with success. So whether you're 40 or 30 or 50, it's kind of irrelevant.
Andrew is a really talented figurative painter who works in London, and he has a show coming up in New York City, and we had a really cool discussion about shows, about figurative painting, about creativity in general, and it was a really enlightening and inspiring conversation that I really suggest you check out. But that is all I have for you today, so hopefully you are inspired to go and get your work done. Go get through those creative blocks, talk to them if you have to, be nice to them, be nice to yourself, and just do your work. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. I love you guys and girls. Go do some awesome, amazing stuff, and we will be here for you tomorrow if you need the push to do that again. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.